Hi, everyone, and thank you for watching. My name is Mark Simon. I'm from Sports Info Solutions. We know that there are many of you that are out there that are interested in pursuing careers in sports. And today we are going to start a series of interviews that we're going to do with members of Sports Info Solutions who can tell you more about what they did and how they got to the career path that they are currently on, and some advice for you as you look to pursue jobs in sports in your future. So we'll begin with Matt Manocherian. He is our Vice President of Football and Research. Matt graduated from Duke in 2008 with a degree in psychology. He has a master's in sports management from Columbia University. He spent 6 years in the NFL as a scout for the Saints and the Browns, then joined SIS as its director of football. He's also an adjunct professor of football and basketball analytics at NYU. Matt, welcome. First of all, when did you know exactly what you wanted to do with your career?
Hey, Mark. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm excited to sit down and talk with you. I knew that I wanted to work in football from when I was in, I think, fifth grade. So about 10 years old. I got past wanting to be an athlete, like a lot of my friends, of course, at that age. And I knew I wanted to be a football coach. And so I figured out at that age that I loved football, and I started drawing up my own playbooks and stuff like that. But then really in high school when I started playing football, and it was the first thing that maybe didn't come as easily to me. School came easily to me. I grew up privileged childhood in a lot of ways. And the football field, nobody cared that I was the smallest one out there, that I wasn't particularly fast. It was, what can you add to the team? And so I had to figure it out kind of out there. And that really, I think, made me love the game, not just for the strategy that I always loved, but also kind of what it taught me about life and how to work and that sort of stuff. So that definitely stuck with me. And I knew from that point that I wanted to give my life back to football, regardless of what I did.
What's the earliest football memory that you have that relates to the career that you're currently in?
That's a funny question. The earliest football memory that I had, I think back a couple of Leon Lett examples. I remember him dropping the ball in the Super Bowl against the Bills when the Cowboys blew out the Bills, and then I remember also I grew up a Dolphins fan actually. My best friend Zach Fearman, he was a football fan, and there was a great Thanksgiving game between the Cowboys and Dolphins as well, where Pete Stoyanovich, I think, was kicking a field goal at the end of the game, and it was kind of tipped at the line of scrimmage, but Leon Lett went and tried to recover it. So it ended up the Dolphins got one more chance, and they ended up winning the game on the second big Leon Lett flub. So I don't know. That's maybe a roundabout connection to poor decision-making in football. And I think there are definitely many other events after that time that led me to be interested in that.
Were you someone who was writing like scouting reports when you were like 8 years old?
It was the playbooks for me. The scouting reports came later. I didn't grow up wanting to be a scout. Scouting came because that's where I ended up kind of when I got my first job in the league. But when I was a kid, it was definitely more drawing up plays, trying to read as much as I could and try to figure out the ways that I could fit plays together in my playbook. In high school, we ran a wing T, so I always knew how the trap play led to the sweep play, and then that tied into waggle. And I would try to figure out how to do that with pro concepts. And I would just draw. I still have old notebooks that I would draw kind of some ridiculous, some maybe worthwhile concepts up in. That I definitely always was. And then Madden. I would play Madden, but I wouldn't play the game. So I'd put it on franchise mode, and I would try to figure out how to draft the best team and do all the free agency transactions and stuff like that.
When you look back and you see that had like importance to you, maybe you don't necessarily see it tangibly, but kind of intangibly.
Absolutely, in my job and then in my life, but like absolutely, it was. I'm happy that existed. It gave me a way to really engage with it in the way that I was interested in engaging with it. And certainly everything I do, that's a lot more applicable to my life than any social studies class that I took growing up. It's a lot more similar to what my actual job is. But, at the same time, if I had been only doing that, I don't think that would have been a very good development plan either.
All right, so let's transition to your time at Duke University. It's certainly a very strong academic school. What are some of the things that you did at Duke that helped you prepare for your career?
Yeah. Well, I went to Duke, and I was between Duke and trying to play like Division III college football, and my parents convinced me that going to Duke was the right decision. But I told my head coach, my high school head coach, that I was going to Duke, and he said, "Oh, you're not playing football." And that was the end of like any playing hopes that I had. But I tried to work for the team at Duke actually, and unfortunately, it was a really tough time in the Duke football era. Duke football's gotten a little bit better, but it was really, really awful for a while there. And at the time, they weren't very welcoming towards student managers. I worked for the team for a few weeks. They threw me into the equipment room. I was kind of fine with all that kind of stuff, but there was no access whatsoever towards anything that was relevant to what I wanted to do in football. They really were doing it. It was equipment room work for people that needed to do work study, and it was just one way to do work study and get the hours in that you needed to pay your way through. And I was really trying to get some involvement with the real football. So that wasn't there, unfortunately. But what I did do was I basically took every physical education related course that they offered. There was no sort of PE major or even minor, but I did take enough courses, I remember, to have more than a minor in PE, and just taking football coaching theory, which is still one of my favorite binders that I have on my shelf today, along with all my stuff from my years at the Saints. And the football coaching, really understanding how to talk to people, what it's about, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to develop? I remember winning, developing, and having fun. Those are the three objectives, and that was kind of the groundwork for everything in that class. So that was a fun experience. We learned about sport finance. We learned about. So I took all these classes, and I just tried to wrap my head around anything I could that was relevant. And my psychology major, a lot of that was really. I majored in social psychology, so kind of where sociology and psychology cross paths. And absolutely everything I did while I was thinking about that was within the scope of, okay, if I'm building an organization, if I'm running a team, if I'm doing this, how can we get everybody to work together best? How do people really, what makes people go, and how does that work? And how do you handle the different people and respond to them? And for me, I went after Duke. I'm sure we'll talk about it. I coached and I worked in the league, and now I work at SIS. But wherever I am, all of those skills, I'm really happy to have learned because when I'm working on a project with the people at SIS, for example, there's not one day that doesn't go by where I realize that I've got two different personalities that I need to handle different ways. I need to be harder on somebody. I need to be more encouraging towards somebody else. But being able to take a step back and have a process for evaluating that's a lot of kind of what I learned and thought about as an undergrad.
So, as an overall kind of broad advice to a college student, it sounds like you're saying get a well rounded education.
That was my experience, and I love that I had that broad vision of things. There are times when I look back and I say, I should have studied engineering and really gone hard on that. And I don't think you can ever go wrong with gaining those sorts of really hard skills. So I would never guide somebody against that. But what I always tried to do was take courses that I was interested in, because I knew I needed to be intrinsically motivated to be locked in with anything like that. So I took things that I was interested in, and I always cared more also about the professor than the class. Sometimes you look at the description of a class and you think this is what I want to learn about, but what's more important is who you're learning from. So looking into what those people's backgrounds are, how they can maybe help you, how you can help them, why you're going to be interested in what they're giving to you, and then just trying out the classes for the first week or two and making sure you have an understanding with the professor. Those are, to me, that's the more important aspect of it, is figuring out something that you can focus in and be really interested in, more so than it is about being broad focused or narrow. Different strokes for different folks.
I want to mention one other thing that you did in college that's a little bit different. We can certainly joke about the fact that you did improv in school, but that's a skill builder that I think college students, even high school students, might not realize that they can take advantage of. What did you get out of doing that?
Yeah, I mean, besides it being a ton of fun, probably the biggest individual thing that I did in college over my 4 years there. We performed in, I think, 150 shows over the course of those 4 years. They were my first friends that I have there, and they're some of my lasting best friends. And we got to do everything that we did was donated to pediatric cancer research. So it was incredibly special for me in terms of a purpose. But the number one skill is yes and. And if you're familiar enough with improv, you're familiar with the concept. But the concept is to yes and somebody. It's not to dead a conversation and have somebody say to you, "Hey, look at the sky," and for you to say, "No, look at the sea." no, that's not what we're talking about here. We were talking about the sky. We don't want to say no. We want a yes, and then we want to build on it. We want a yes and look at the sky. Oh yes, I noticed the birds are really flying around there today. So you're engaging with the other person's thought, and you're building something on it, and then you're giving the other person an opportunity to yes and back to you. And that's how you build an improv scene. That's how it's at its very core. But this is a listening exercise for life. My biggest frustrations is with people when I'm having a conversation and they're not hearing the words that are coming out of my mouth. It seems like I'm saying something, but I'm not sure that they're really picking up. And that's a skill, that listening, that you have to develop to be able to do improv and to be able to have that back and forth, that give and take. So no matter where you are, you're going to fall into all sorts of biases, and you're going to have all kinds of issues unless you can really learn um, to support people in the way that you listen to them, and to actively listen to them, and to yes and on their ideas. Um, these are some of the biggest things that I think I learned from improv.
And those can be applied not just in football or athletics, but in just about any other job that you would pursue, I presume.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a great example is I look at the work that we do together, Mark, at SIS. And before the two of us came on board at Sports Info Solutions, one, it was not a football company, it was a baseball company. I came on board, and I've had a lot to do with the football buildup. We didn't have a public face before we had Mark Simon. And Simon came on board. We built up our Twitter presence. We have this sort of thing that you're doing right now with me. We have a vibrant Sports Info Solutions blog that has material coming out on it every single day. We used to be lucky if we had something coming out once a week. And it's enabled us to communicate all of this about analytics in baseball and football with everybody. And I don't know how we could possibly uh, have accomplished what we have in terms of being able to build what we've had. Yeah, I think by yourself, you would have been able to build up the baseball public facing. And yeah, maybe by myself, I would have been able to build up the football. But now we have this great public facing football kind of sphere of influence at SIS that wouldn't have happened if we weren't able to build on one another's ideas. Because I don't know the first thing about running a blog or about Twitter or about it, but because we were able to get into a room together, and if you have an idea about Reddit, and I don't say, Mark, that's totally ridiculous. What are you talking about, Reddit? Like that's saying no. Or if you say Reddit and I say, what about Gymboree? That's not yes anding either. That's me going in another direction. But when you say Reddit and I say, oh, I've seen Reddit. Here's some things that I think could be helpful about it. Even if I'm skeptical about 90% of it, if I say, oh, these are the 10% of Reddit that, and then we can build, and then you can have a yes and relationship. So I think that it happens on stage, but also you have to learn to trust people. And like you talk about with an improv group, you got to learn to trust people on the stage with you. At the end of the day, you're it's very tough thing to do, to go on stage and be that kind of naked in front of everybody with no script, nothing going on. You really got to trust that person that you're there with. If you don't learn to yes and with them, then you're gonna have a hard time making a really good show. So I feel like that's helped us learn to trust each other too.
All right, so that ventured way off path, but let's get back on the football path here. And I think that the things that Matt brought up there are certainly a good pieces of advice for younger people that are looking to pursue careers in sports, which is essentially what the intent of this show is. So now let's focus. How did your scouting career come to be?
So I told you I wanted to be a coach since I was in fifth grade, and then when I was in high school, it really cemented it. So when I went to Duke, I tried to work for the team there a little bit, but it was really when I left Duke, I went right back to my high school football coach, and I said, "I want to coach for you." He gave me a job, volunteer coach, doing the wide receivers and DBs, my positions that I played in high school, and it was a great opportunity to coach, because I think really good advice. Going back to the advice thing, if you want to do something as your career, then start doing it. Figure out a way to do it. If you want to write, start writing now. If you want to be a scout, start scouting and putting scouting reports. If you want to coach, go get out there and figure out a way to volunteer and get out there on the field. So he gave me that opportunity, and I absolutely loved coaching. I had a day job doing real estate. But then I did that for a year, and I was sending my resume, trying to find any connection that I could. I read Malcolm Gladwell, and I learned about the power of loose ties. So I was just trying to send anybody my information I could for an informational interview, anything like that. And looking for a job as a GA for a college team, as a recruiting assistant, any sort of internships at NFL teams. And eventually, through a friend of a friend of a friend, I got an internship with the New Orleans Saints, which was a summer camp internship, a 6-week summer camp internship. So I did that in the summer of 2009, my first year after I had coached that 1 year after college. And I was there for 6 weeks, and we, filled the refrigerators with Gatorades, checked people in for meals, set up the fields, set up meeting rooms, just any sort of gopher task that you can imagine. Oh, a lot of driving people around to and from the airport, things like that. Just all those sort of tasks. And it was really mostly college kids and actually a couple of high school kids that I was doing this job with. So I was by far the oldest, which was both kind of weird, but also kind of an advantage because it actually gave me a path to kind of make a way for me to become a part of the team in the long term. So I did that for 6 weeks. And the great thing about that was whenever you finished all the stuff that they asked you to do, you could go up to the scouting room and you could hang out in there and you could peel the magnets off from the draft that they had used from the draft before. They had, infinite magnets for you to peel. And I'll go up there and start peeling. And then every once in a while, if you were peeling 4 hours of magnets, you might get lucky enough that somebody would pop in looking for an intern to do something and you could get a different task. So I started making roster cards for practices because somebody asked me to do that. They figured out that I was kind of competent. I knew that I was doing, but finished up the 6 weeks, went back to New York, went back to coaching, went back to my real estate day job. And it wasn't until the following year when I went back down for that same internship. I went again the following year. I came in the first day. I told Mickey Loomis, this time I'm not leaving. And he actually laughed at me right in my face, just kind of like, okay, kid, whatever you say. But sure enough, over the course of the next 6 weeks, I figured out a way to make myself kind of indispensable. And I was able to kind of turn that into my first full-time scouting job.
So what are the keys to being a good scout?
That's a great question.
And how do you define good?
That's part of the difficulty with scouting is that I don't think there's been great infrastructure around evaluating scouts and understanding what's important in scouting, especially in football. I think some other sports have taken some steps forward, and football is starting to get there. But one of my big frustrations, I think, was you look around football, there's a lot of nepotism. There's a lot of who do you know? Who did you play for? And that kind of stuff can be valuable. You can develop a lot of trust in people that way. But also that's going to limit your candidate pool in a lot of ways. And it's going to kind of create less of a meritocracy. So part of what made me want to get into this side of things is actually having a little bit better methodology for understanding which of these things are important, understanding how well scouts can predict corners versus defensive ends versus quarterbacks, and which of the traits that scouts are looking at are the ones that are actually relevant, and which scouts are actually good at doing things. I think a lot of teams have beliefs that certain scouts are better at scouting some positions than others, but I don't think those people have more than anecdotal proof of that. And it's really hard to do because you can only really judge yourself on the people that you actually end up picking in your organization. And that doesn't happen very often for the number of scouts that you have. So there's a lot that goes into it. But at the end of the day, you have to be a good writer. Scouting is, at the end of the day, report writing. You've got to be resilient. So you got to be okay being on the road, being in a lot of different situations. And I think that's why scouts really need to love it, because I think the resiliency comes from the love. And the willingness to sleep on the road and all that kind of stuff. And along with that resiliency, I'll say you have to love it. To be a good scout, you have to to me, I think you have to be intrinsically motivated. I don't think there's any way that unless you really fully enjoy what you're doing, that you can be an effective evaluator consistently, because it has to be something that you're engaging with at a ridiculous level.
All right. So what does a good scouting report look like?
Good scouting report is clear. I joke around a lot that, especially with the number of scouting reports that I look at from young scouts coming out at SIS, you can tell a bad scouting report right away. It's poorly written, or not full sentences, or it's unclear, or it's conflicting with itself. We give him a good grade for speed, but then we say his speed is suspect.
things that don't match up like that. So I always joke, you can tell a bad report really easily. I can tell you 10 times out of 10, if it's a bad report, I can identify that within a minute. But telling good reports apart is a little bit more difficult. At the end of the day, you're going to have to really understand the player that you're talking about in order to evaluate any report on that player. But if a good report is getting it done, it's clear, it's not conflicting with itself, it's concise, yet it uses full sentences. People think that just writing like cool little like all caps scouting report type things is relevant. I don't think that's very helpful for a GM or anybody trying to read it. But I think most importantly, you paint a picture. Ryan Pace, he's now the GM of the Bears. He was my first mentor in New Orleans. He was an incredibly vivid picture painter of what the player would be for your team. When you saw him write up a player, you understood exactly what that player looked like without having to watch the film on that player. I think that's your goal at the end of the day when you're a scout, is describing exactly what you see without actually having to see all the film play out. So those are, I think, what make up good scouting reports. Also, structure. I find that if you don't structure all of your scouting reports the same way, I don't know what you're doing. You should be able to read all of my scouting reports and know exactly when I'm going to talk about the different attributes that'll make up the player based on what position I'm talking about and the general cadence. That's something that'll always look a little different from person to person, but there should be consistency within each person.
Before we transition to your time at SIS, you mentioned mentorships, having the mentor in Ryan Pace. What are the keys to being a good mentee in the mentor-mentee relationship?
To be a good mentee, I think sometimes when I've been a bad mentee, especially when I was younger, I was worried about annoying my mentor too much. And at the end of the day, my mentors had revealed myself to me. I've had different mentors over the years, and once they identify yourself to you, of course, you don't want to bother them when they're busy or anything like that. But the more you can communicate with them about what your goals are, what you're trying to do with your career, offer ways to help them, and just continuing to engage with them. I think a big mistake that people make is thinking that they're being annoying. And I don't want to encourage people to be annoying, but I think that if you were having the thought that maybe you're being annoying, then you're probably not one of those people that's always being annoying. So I would encourage people to engage with their mentor more and understand that you're not always going to hear back right away, and that's okay. And that's a little bit your responsibility as the mentee to be reaching out and keeping that extension open.
How did you come to be at SIS?
SIS was through a mentor. So I left the Cleveland Browns, and at that time, I was hired by one guy, he was fired, and a different guy brought me in, and we didn't see eye to eye on the way things were going there. So it was kind of a clean break when my contract ran out, and I was trying to figure out my next steps. I did some work with a sports agency a little bit, helping them do scouting reports on football players, but that wasn't really for me. So I started talking to this guy, Vince Gennaro, who was the president of Sabre at the time and also was running the Columbia University sports management program. And Vince talked to me about coming to the Columbia sports management graduate program, and really sold me on the idea that baseball had already been through its Moneyball phase, kind of. And this was coming in every sport. It was already beginning in basketball at the time, and now we've seen it go on. And it was going to happen in football too. And he talked about, I was in a really unique, interesting space because I had this football experience. I had my 5 years working for the teams and scouting departments, doing that kind of work. And I also had, some upside based on my academic history that he saw. And he said, if you come here and you can learn these skills, these are going to be the people that are really pushing these sports along and making the big advancements into the future. So I like to say I drank all of the Kool-Aid that he was serving, and that was in the form of every class that I could take in the program on analytics, which involved, of course, baseball analytics, basketball analytics, soccer analytics, and trying to learn just all the different concepts that have been used in all of these sports to help make them smarter, so to speak. And from there, I actually, it was through Vince who had a friendship with Ben Jedlovec, the then president of Baseball Info Solutions, as it was known at the time. Uh, Vince connected me with Ben and with Scott Spratt, who was helping lead up the beginning of a football department at SIS. And it ended up being just a great fit in terms of being the guy that came on and helped kind of oversee the buildup of our football vertical. So it was all Vince in that connection.
I feel like sometimes that you view the folks here at SIS as kind of the 33rd NFL scouting group. You have all the teams, and then there's SIS. What goes into training people, which is a key component of the work that you do here?
Yeah, we are the biggest scouting department in the NFL, bar none. So, especially all under one roof. Two big things that I would say, because there's two aspects. Number one is what we do at Sports Info Solutions on the day-to-day. These guys are trained to chart different data points, and these are the same data points that are going into our data sets that we're sharing with teams, with media, different people like that. All of our various clients. And we have at least 4 people watch every game, and they're watching from all different angles, and they really need to understand football. So for all of those people, what makes a good scout is somebody who's conscientious, somebody who understands football, and somebody who's a good worker, and is, like I said before, you have to love it, because otherwise sitting around for 40 hours charting football games is not very fun. But if you love it, then, and you're conscientious and you know what you're doing, then we can get some really good scouts out of you. So that's the main part of their job, and that's great. But then there's also the scout school component of what we do here, and that's writing the scouting reports that go into the football rookie handbook, and really kind of developing the traditional scouting side of things. And in terms of that, it's a lot of the same skills. You have to understand what you're looking at. You have to really love it, because you have to really engage with it on a different level. But in that side of it, the writing is, I think, what's important. I think people undersell all the time how much being a scout is a writing job. At the end of the day, scouting reports are your product. It's like writing a book report when you had an English class in middle school. You got to write that report at the end of the day. So if you really don't like writing those reports and putting your thoughts on paper about what the players are, then it's probably not as good a job for you as you think it is, because it sounds like it's just watching football all the time.
All right, so we're wrapping up here with Matt Manocherian, and I wanted to give kind of an overview of everything that we've talked about so far. What are the biggest takeaways that you would want someone to get from in terms of career development towards the kind of career path that you've been on?
The biggest things that I would want people to do is figure out what you're intrinsically motivated to do, what really makes you tick, what you really love, and also figure out what you're good at, because that's really important too. It shouldn't be just what you love. That's not going to be good enough to separate you from other people. Take a job like scouting or a job in sports analytics. Just loving it the most is not enough. There's a ton of people that love this stuff. So you got to figure out where those things align and really pursue that wholeheartedly.
Matt can be found online at LinkedIn and on Twitter at Matt Mano, Mattmano. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mark.
We hope you enjoyed this career development session. If you'd like to know more about our company, check us out at sportsinfosolutions.com or at Twitter at sportsinfo_SIS.